And even those old foreign policy hands who supported Kennedy thought it was a fine idea as long as it was kept small. Academic and State Department officials agreed. Proceed with caution, they urged. Start with just a few hundred volunteers. Don't create a fiasco, they said. Don't let this experiment get out of hand. If they'd gotten their way, I suspect the Peace Corps might not even exist today. But just as a late-night burst of exuberance gave birth to the Peace Corps in Ann Arbor, Michigan, a similar bolt of sleepless inspiration kept it alive. Holed up in a hotel room not far from where I'm speaking today on the floor of the United States Senate, with only a few typewriters and a stack of blank papers, two aides, only two of them, one named Sergeant Shriver and the other named Harris Wofford, who turned out many years later to be a colleague of ours here in the United States Senate, sat in that hotel room, just the two of them, with a typewriter and a blank sheet of paper, and comprising the entirety of the Peace Corps staff, as they called it, had been tasked with figuring out how to put this outrageous idea into practice. The one thing that the two of these men knew, Sergeant Shriver later told us, was that the cautious, conventional approach currently in vogue wouldn't work. America would only have one chance to get it right. So it was that Sergeant Shriver happened to be in the office at 3 o'clock in the morning, not unlike the hour in Ann Arbor, Michigan, reading a paper prepared by a State Department employee who had sent along some ideas. His name was Warren Wiggins. Warren Wiggins called his paper The Towering Task, end of quote, a reference to JFK's first State of the Union address, where the young president said, and we quote him as he spoke that day to the State of the Union, "The problems are towering and unprecedented, and the response must be towering and unprecedented as well." Warren Wiggins called for a towering and unprecedented Peace Corps. He wrote, 100 youths engaged in agricultural work of some sort in Brazil might pass by unnoticed, except the problems involved. But 5,000 American youths helping to build Brasilia might warrant the full attention and support of the President of Brazil himself. Where a handful of young people might present a nuisance to a foreign ambassador, an army of motivated young Americans could make a real difference. And besides, wasn't it a moment for great ambition? At 3 o'clock in the morning, Sergeant Shriver read Warren Wiggins' conclusion. The Peace Corps needed to begin with a quantum jump, and it needed to begin immediately by executive order, with as many as 5,000 to 10,000 volunteers right away. By 9 o'clock that same morning, Warren Wiggins himself was sitting along Sergeant Shriver in that very hotel room, drafting a report for the President of the United States. And within a month of that date, President John Kennedy had created the Peace Corps by executive order. Within 2 years, more than 7,000 young Americans were serving across the globe. And that number had more than doubled by 1966, the year that I joined the Peace Corps. One of those young Americans, as I mentioned, was the person who's speaking to you this afternoon. I was a 22-year-old English major at Providence College, and I arrived in the small village of Benito Monción in the Dominican Republic. As a young person, I spoke barely any Spanish at that hour, that day, had little idea of what I was doing, and certainly didn't have a clue that more than 40 years later, I'd be standing on the floor of the United States Senate explaining that the Peace Corps gave him the richest 2 years of his life. I owe those 2 years and the impact they had on all of my years since to John Kennedy's 2 a.m. question and the Warren Wiggins paper that Sergeant Shriver read at 3 a.m. in the morning. From the story of the Peace Corps and my own story, we can learn 3 things. First, the Peace Corps works, Mr. President. Besides simple labor and goodwill, every American we send abroad brings with him or her another chance to make America known to a world that often fears and suspects us and our motives. And every American who returns to our country from that service comes home as a citizen strengthened with the knowledge of the world in which he or she has just lived it. As Sergeant Shriver said, the Peace Corps volunteers come home to the United States realizing that there are billions, yes, billions of human beings not enraptured by our pretensions or our practices or even our standards of conduct. Second, Mr. President, size matters. The perils of a small, timid Peace Corps are just as clear today as they were in 1961. Just as then, advocates of a stripped-down mission make the same arguments. Sending untrained, untested students only aggravates our host countries and raises the chance of mishap. So let's send a few experts. And just as in 1961, our response is fundamentally the same and still fundamentally correct. Of course, we need volunteers of the highest quality, but we need the highest quantities as well to make a difference. Third, of course, size comes at a cost. We know that. The bigger any organization grows, the slower it gets. The Peace Corps that charted its course in a hotel room with a staff of 2 now enjoys a staff of over 100 personnel in a fine office building not far from the White House. But even the most groundbreaking ideas must all make in good time what the philosopher Gramsci called the long march through the institutions. And where President Kennedy once predicted that within a few decades our nation would have more than 1 million returned volunteers, today, of course, less than 200,000 of us have had the opportunity to serve over 50 years. And so, Mr. President, the legislation I offer today is designed to help the Peace Corps not only grow, and I have joined the many voices calling for it to grow dramatically, but also to reform. To those who know and love the Peace Corps, as so many do, reform is an uncomfortable subject. After all, we don't want to destroy what has made this institution so remarkable and unique. There wouldn't be a Peace Corps today if John Fitzgerald Kennedy had stuck to the script in Ann Arbor. There wouldn't be a Peace Corps if thousands of students acting on their own initiative hadn't caught his attention with their movement. And there might not be a Peace Corps if Sergeant Shriver and Harris Wofford had listened to the respectable voices of caution in those early days of 1961. The Peace Corps is unlike any other organ of our government because of its uniquely grassroots origin, and we can't treat it like any other organ of government for those reasons. So the Peace Corps Improvement and Expansion Act, which I'll be presenting in a few moments, does not include a list of mandates, Mr. President. It does not micromanage either. Instead, it asks those who have written this remarkable success story, from the director to managers and country directors to current and returned volunteers, to serve once more by undertaking a thorough assessment of the Peace Corps and developing a comprehensive strategic plan for reforming and revitalizing this remarkable organization. Just as JFK's question to those Michigan students sparked the Peace Corps, asking questions today, some 50 years later, I believe will strengthen it. How can volunteers be better managed? How can they be better trained? Can we improve the recruiting that goes on? Are we sending our volunteers to the right nations around the world? And why do we have volunteers in Samoa and Tonga, but not in Indonesia, in Egypt, or in Brazil? Are we still achieving the broader goals of the Peace Corps and helping our country meet 21st century challenges? And most of all, how can we strengthen and grow this remarkable organization without losing that unique spark, the ambitious sense of the possible that led John Fitzgerald Kennedy to stay up late dreaming with those students in Ann Arbor, and Sergeant Shriver and Harris Wofford to stay up late reading Warren Wiggins' paper? As Mr. President, Warren Wiggins died 2 years ago at the age of 84. His obituary quoted Harris Wofford. And let me quote, if I can, that obituary. Harris Wofford wrote, "I think he embodied the watchwords that were once given to me. We must be more inventive if we're going to do our duty," end of quote. Mr. President, inventiveness and duty, two qualities that don't often go together. But the Peace Corps is the result of just such a combination. It has strengthened our nation, improved, I think, the world in which we live, stands today as one of the single accomplishments of the 20th century, been supported by Republican and Democratic administrations over the last 50 years. As I said at the outset of these remarks, except for my own family, nothing has meant more in my life or in the lives of so many others than the experience I enjoyed so many years ago. Today, we honor that accomplishment of this organization. But let us commit to strengthening and expanding the Peace Corps by passing this legislation, which I'll send to the desk momentarily. Let us strive to inspire future generations to walk the path of service and exploration, the one that led me and 180,000 of others, of our nation's citizens, to nations such as the Dominican Republic or Ethiopia, where Paul Tsongas went, and then years later to arrive at this institution, which I cherish and love as well. And let us never lose that spirit, that idealism, that ambition that led a young president of a young nation to ask a generation to serve. And with that, Mr. President, I yield the floor and I send to the desk the proposed legislation.